So we're framing this as insights and learning, and essentially it's a more in-depth look at some of the projects and updates that have been shared, both at the Justice and Innovation Group and at other groups that certainly we've been a part of, mainly information sharing networks. There hasn't really been enough time available at those sessions to go into greater detail about how this information and learning can be implemented in our work, and a more kind of conscientious examination of what additional resources we might need to make those changes. So this is what this session is for. It is a tester session. So we're doing this as a pilot, as a one-off for the time being, but if people feel like the content and the format of the sessions are useful, we'll definitely look to do more of these probably in the autumn. And then just a reminder about the network's role in all of this. So our aim really is to link the community that we're supporting with knowledge and expertise that can improve their work. We focus on areas of interest as defined or highlighted by the community, and we bring together learning to understand more about the issues and the solutions available. So I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Jess Mant, who joins us from Monash University in Australia. So good evening, Jess. Thank you for giving up your evening to come here. And Dr. Dan Newman and Danielle O'Shea from the University of Cardiff to share an overview of the research project that they are conducting on blended service delivery models.
Thank you so much, Martha. Oh, the spotlight took me by surprise. Yes, so just as some of you are aware, that I was based at Cardiff University at the time that we conducted this research, and I've since moved to Melbourne to take up a role at Monash University. So just briefly, as a non-Indigenous Australian presenting to you from Australian lands, I'd just quickly like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which I'm presenting to you today, and that is the peoples of the Kulin Nation. I acknowledge their elders past and present, and that the land was never ceded. Okay, so what I'd like to do is just share my, can I share my PowerPoint? Would that be okay?
You should be able to, Jess.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, so this project obviously was generously funded by the Litigant in Person Support Strategy, which diverted funds from the Ministry of Justice and administered by the Access to Justice Foundation. And we were very privileged to have the chance to undertake this project into blended advice. It was the first empirical investigation into the emergence of blended advice. And by blended advice, we are referring to advice provision which involves a combination of face-to-face and remote methods. And so I think, as Martha mentioned, there's been quite a bit of discussion about what to call this new kind of world of advice that we're witnessing at the moment. And hybrid advice is also equally valid, but for ease of communication, we stuck with blended because that was the language that was emerging through the focus groups and the interviews that we were doing. So we're going to stick with that terminology for now, but of course, we'd definitely be open to more discussion about what we would call it in the future. It was conducted by myself, Dan Newman, and Danny O'Shea. So the main goal of this study was to consider how the pandemic had affected the ways that the advice sector was providing advice and how those methods had changed since March 2020. And because this is quite an exploratory study, because nothing like this has been done before, we decided to focus on 3 specific areas of law, and that was debt, social welfare, and housing. And the goal of the study was to kind of explore what organisations were doing in terms of adapting to the pandemic, in terms of this initial shift where everybody was forced to rapidly change their advice provision to remote methods, and then how they were then developing that in light of the gradual return to face-to-face advice becoming more of an option. So we wanted to know how that initial shift had affected advice organisations, as well as what they were looking forward towards the future. So how were they thinking about how those methods could be retained, adapted, changed, or abandoned in light of the post-pandemic world of advice? So we were looking at kind of the models that advice organisations were using, whether they wanted to go back to fully face-to-face, whether they wanted to shift to fully remote or whether they would like a blend of both, and how that was dependent on the specific needs of individual clients. We also wanted to understand how clients themselves perceived those advice methods, what kind of challenges and opportunities they felt when they were required to engage either fully remotely, fully face-to-face, or through blended, specifically this new model of blended advice. And in understanding both of those things, we wanted to try and provide a vision for the appropriate role that blended methods might have in the future, and how it may have transformed the way that we actually think about providing legal advice in the future. So in terms of what we did, we designed this study according to a qualitative methodology because, as I said, there was not a huge amount of knowledge about how this method of advice provision has developed. So we wanted to kind of try and explore the main themes before trying to create something more representative. So in order to explore the kind of themes that were emerging, we started off by conducting focus groups across those three areas of law with representatives from advice organisations. And so we had 24 participants who came to share their views and experiences about using blended models of advice. And we then followed up those themes that emerged from those focus groups by conducting interviews with clients who had received advice during the pandemic. And so we did 10 interviews with clients across those three areas of law. And then finally, we followed this up with 6 case studies as well. So this was an opportunity for advice representatives to provide us with more in-depth analysis of how they had interacted with specific client groups. And so this was a chance to really illustrate the themes that had emerged from both the focus groups and the interviews, what works, what doesn't work, and what they think should happen in the future. I think I'm going to hand over to Danny next.
Yeah, so as can be seen from the slides, we've categorized the data from the focus groups and client interviews as being either related to the opportunities and benefits of blended advice or its challenges. And due to how connected some of these advantages and disadvantages are, I'll be drawing some connections between them as we discuss them. So first off, the frontline experiences. So the first of the opportunities is blended advice's ability to broaden the range of clients that can reach these services. And this was incredibly important across all sectors, as of the pandemic, there was a great increase in the number of clients that these services needed to support. And whilst it may have been that these clients were encountering legal issues for the first time during this pandemic, this is uncertain, and it may be because these services were more accessible due to the remote format. However, it needs to also be considered that there's also the potential exclusion of certain client groups, as noted in the challenges, and that whereas being remote allowed them to overcome geographical limitations and also be more accessible to populations like disabled people, people with caring commitments, it also potentially excluded people who lack the digital literacy or technological resources to access these during the pandemic. And as well as this, we have the opportunity of enabling advisors to work more efficiently, which it was often said that going remote allowed service providers to maximize their time, and that this was noted across all sectors, especially with there were fewer missed appointments across advice. And this was noted particularly across social welfare, I believe. But it was also noted that this led to a more resource intensive approach, as noted in the challenges, as more clients, less missed appointments means more work. And that due to the quick turnaround expected from organisations of the pandemic, there was a lack of infrastructure, which led to a lot of innovation, as noted in the opportunities, but also led to a lot of strain on staff and existing frameworks. And this led to great innovative practices, such as collaborations between nonprofit groups and local authorities. But it also meant that without these issues, you wouldn't have needed to have come up with these innovative practices in the first place. And that, sorry. And that whilst flexibility and accessibility were really shown in these approaches, it was also shown how ill-prepared everyone was due to issues ranging from lack of resources to funding. And these also showed similarly to in clients' experiences, which were often very reflective of the experiences reported in focus groups. So if we could click over to that slide, that would be great. Brilliant, thank you. So as said earlier, the move to remote services resulted in an increase in accessibility for some people, but not for others. And the majority of practitioners that were spoken to were forwarding the idea of a blended approach to advice giving after opening up. And this was very much supported by clients and was found to be a very welcome practice. However, flexibility was noted to be an intrinsic part of that decision and when voicing that preference. And that was what fed into the increased autonomy and empowerment within the advice process that a lot of people found. And that was especially true for people that improved their digital literacy as a result of the restrictions that were imposed. However, this isn't the same for everyone, and without the support for people who were struggling to access these services, and by acknowledging that going digital by default would limit access, then you need to consider flexibility in the future and that you need more of a triage approach rather than a blanket statement for all client service users. And as noted previously by the focus groups, there was a limited ability to develop trust with advisors without face-to-face contact. However, it was found that having an element of social interaction, even in remote practices, did help build this rapport, and that could be beneficial in the future and may help overcome some of the barriers that were felt with services providing things like instant messaging or telephone-only advice. However, without more of a flexible approach, those barriers can't really be overcome. And I've run a little bit early, but here's to Dan.
Hey everyone. So on the next couple of slides, we're going to talk about the future of blended advice. We're going to start first of all thinking about the things that our report picks out that don't work for moving forward. And the first of those things that don't work are broad brush approaches. You can see there we said this is taking a default approach to clients no longer aligns with their expectations, nor what the pandemic has taught us about their needs. One of the things we got from the focus groups with advisors was that we were at a particular moment of reflection. You know, the pandemic had a massive impact over the last couple of years, and now advisors were thinking about what the new normal would look like. And a big bit of that was reflected on how clients had been approaching services in different ways and had changed views on what services they wanted. So we had to work out, you know, what is it going to look like going forward? How can we deal with the challenges? Challenges being things like the pandemic had made it more difficult to reach some marginalized and disadvantaged groups, of course. But how can we also maximize the opportunities it created? So opportunities like enabling the sector to meet some new demand for legal need or improving accessibility of services for certain groups. And blended advice seems to be a key part of that. So we have to think about what it's going to look like going forward. And the main element of that, so what we're thinking about with these broad brush approaches is that great amount of care needs to be taken, because one of the things that advisors told us is that there are rarely clear-cut categories of client or problem. We have to recognize difference and we have to plan for individuality. And that feeds forward into our second point there, another one of our things that don't work, which is overlooking the importance of face-to-face contact for some clients. So that's quite a big part of working out what balance of remote and face-to-face methods we have going forward is that blended advice shouldn't mean face-to-face is phased out altogether. Remote advice methods have become increasingly normalized, but they're not for everyone. And we hear time and time again from advisors, but also from clients, highlighting the reasons why face-to-face might be necessary in some cases, why it might be desired in some cases. It could be a practical issue, like we might hear about how some client might be very comfortable getting advice on the telephone, but at some point, they're going to need to take their paperwork physically to an office. Or it might be more broader concerns, like advisors were quite attuned to the idea that certain groups will always need face-to-face advice, that certain groups will find it difficult to engage with services remotely. That might include clients who live in rural locations. It might include clients who perhaps don't have access to a telephone. We heard about some areas of law where it could be particularly common, like in housing, especially with clients who are facing homelessness. But our third point here is probably the most important of our what doesn't work elements. So the suitability of blended models cannot be reliably predicted by problem type or client characteristics. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. So while we can pick out some emerging themes, like I just did, and like we do in the report, also things like we heard about how some younger client groups have often been more receptive to advice with remote methods because they particularly engage with approaches like using WhatsApp. What the research told us is that it's important not to be too prescriptive. We shouldn't be too prescriptive about who might hold what attitudes towards different methods. And we certainly shouldn't base that on conjecture or presumption. So two disabled people might have the same label for whatever their difficulty or difference is, but one might find remote methods mitigates that in terms of getting advice. One might find remote methods exacerbates that, or two people who speak English as a second language might have quite contrasting views about whether face-to-face works for them. Some might find face-to-face makes it easier to communicate in English. Some might find it makes it more awkward for them. So what we learned was that it's important not to target advice models towards clients based on simplified assumptions. What we have to do is bear in mind the possible differences that can arise within client groups and legal problems. And one of the most crucial aspects we heard was that it's important to ask individual clients what they require. And if you could flip to the next slide, please, Jess, I'll build on that point when we think about the future in terms of what does work, okay? And our first point there is that success with blended advice models hinges on the ability of organizations to be flexible to individual clients' needs. So a really key message we got from this research was that there are no easy answers on what the future of blended advice should look like. We can't just roll out a blanket model and say everyone needs to adopt this. What we heard was that we always need to keep in mind all those differences, and that is no hiding the fact that is gonna create challenges for the sector. It creates greater complexity. It creates all kinds of logistical and organizational issues for the advice sector, because to all intents and purposes, it's increasingly incumbent to offer what amounts to bespoke services. And that task of determining the balance between remote and face-to-face advice is something that the sector and advisors are going to need to consider on a case-by-case basis. And that means the advice sector needs to be flexible, like we say there, adaptable, collaborative, innovative, like Danny said a couple of minutes ago. And we know the sector is all of those things. It's shown that throughout the pandemic. And it's how we got to this stage of having blended advice that works, because the sector has been flexible, adaptable, collaborative, innovative, but it's going to need to be continued in order to work out how to match appropriate methods with individual clients. And that's where that second point comes in. The future will require advisors to work directly with clients, ascertaining needs, capabilities, and preferences. Blended methods can be more efficient. Blended methods can also be more effective. They have the potential to empower clients in a way that maybe didn't happen before. It gives more options for clients. It's not about, it shouldn't be about forcing clients to accept a service in a form that they don't want or doesn't work for them. It can actually lead to circumstances in which advisors can meet clients' needs and make sure the advice works for them and makes it more effective. It improves the client's experiences. And one of the things we heard was that it's hopefully more likely that they will come back and get help maybe earlier as and when they need help going forward. But crucial to all of this is our final point on the future of blended advice, which is about triage. So initial triage at the point that clients present with a willingness to adapt approach throughout if necessary. The success of blended advice so much relies on the ability of advisors to be able to cater to their clients' needs, and if possible, to try and include the clients in the process of deciding how and when advice should be provided. It's always going to be tempting, I think it's tempting for all of us, to target particular models at certain client groups. So you might say that older client groups are generally going to prefer face-to-face. But what we heard from advisors is that there's often a much more complex set of factors and circumstances that determine suitability. And that makes it hard to preempt or anticipate the kind of advice methods that any individual client will need. The way to do that is through what we were told as being an initial triage. So this assessment when a client first presents to an organization. When I talked about the flexibility of the sector, one of the things we heard from a lot of organizations was how even during the height of the pandemic, when face-to-face meetings were extremely difficult, they were finding ways to make an initial face-to-face appointment so they could do this triage in the most effective way. Because the ideal scenario for triage we heard quite often was to be able to see and meet that client in person and then work with them to determine whether they needed more face-to-face going forward or whether a remote method might work for them. But what all this means, this idea for triage, this idea of being adaptable, is that there are going to be increasing challenges for the sector. There's resource constraints attached to that. It makes it harder to forward plan. It has impacts in terms of workload. It has impacts in terms of well-being. So we have to understand this and factor it into any future planning about how the sector is organised and funded. I think we'll probably come back to that at some points later. But for now, I'll hand over to Jess, who's going to talk about what next.
Thank you, Dan. Yes, so essentially, as Danny and Dan have drawn together the key kind of aspects of our findings and our view for what comes next, there are three key lessons I think we've pulled out. And the problem with doing a research project like this, which is qualitative and is exploratory, is that you often end up with more questions at the end than you did at the beginning. And that's essentially true, but nevertheless, we have learned some important lessons throughout the pandemic and throughout this project as well. And the first is, of course, that the future of advice is very different from the advice context that we had before the pandemic. The future of advice is a flexible and bespoke service for each client. And that's a very different kind of working context to what we've been used to. And it's something that we were already working towards gradually before the pandemic with increased digitization and higher demands and higher expectations of services. But it is something which is rapidly accelerated during the pandemic. And now client expectations are no longer aligned with how we used to work. And I think that everybody here probably is conscious of the fact that client expectations, client accessibility, and the expectations post-pandemic are very different. And so we do need to think about what kind of models we can implement in order to provide this kind of flexible and bespoke service to each client. And in order to evaluate those kinds of models, we need to reflect on the different ways that we are starting to do things. And in doing our research project, we've identified quite a few different examples whereby that initial triage is quite central. So you may have a client who presents virtually in the first instance, and therefore you can use that as a point from which to triage them to determine whether or not they need to come in to see you face to face, or if they're more comfortable engaging with you online and then adapting as necessary to those circumstances. Vice versa, you may have somebody who will only present in person, and then you have to build off that and work out what works for that client. And so essentially, the blended advice models, I think it's very tempting to ask us what models work. And that, again, keeps coming back to our key message, which is that it depends. It depends on the circumstances and it depends on the client. And so the only kind of common feature that all of these models have is the commitment to flexibility and that initial triage. Those are the two things that make it work in every instance. And so essentially what we would like to recommend is that we're in this new post-pandemic world of advice, and the mode of advice is not the only thing that's changed. The other thing that's changed is the context of legal need. There's an enormous increase in the amount of legal need that's emerged as a direct consequence of the pandemic, which we have seen in the last few months, last couple of years. But there's also likely to be a great deal of stored up legal need as well, which hasn't yet emerged and will emerge over the next few years as the economic implications of the pandemic actually begin to unfold. So there is an incredible increase in the amount of need to be met. There's also a broader reach of clients through these blended methods, and all of those different things change the way that we are able to provide advice. So essentially what our research project revealed is that we not only need to investigate the methods of advice provision, but also how effective they are in terms of this broader context of how legal need is changing. And so underpinning all of that, of course, is the third point, which is that blended advice is more resource intensive. And so success with those models will require a well-supported sector. And so the biggest call I think we can make with this project is the reality that the post-pandemic world of advice is very different. It's potentially higher quality, potentially better in terms of reaching a broader range of clients, but the success and the opportunities and the benefits of that post-pandemic blended advice method will only hinge on increased levels of resources. The pre-pandemic world of legal advice was already under-resourced in terms of its financial security, the ability to long-term plan in terms of your advice organization. And so post-pandemic, that's even more of a pressing issue. And I suppose that's kind of the big theme that underpins the success and the opportunities of blended advice. And to maximize those benefits, that's really something we want to emphasize as being quite central. I think that is us done, Martha.
Thank you so much, guys. It was a real demonstration to me of one of the ways that we know this topic is supremely important is because we've evidently have several research projects working on this topic in tandem, albeit with a slightly different jurisdictional focus. And I'm really pleased to welcome Kerry Hutton here today, who's recently launched a report with the Hamlyn Foundation on how the remote delivery of immigration advice specifically has evolved during COVID, including the digital and capacity implications of this change. So, Kerry, I'm going to spotlight you now, I'm afraid. But I know you did the report, the launch of that report just a couple of weeks ago. So we won't go into the report itself in a huge amount of detail, but having heard from Jess and Dan, do you think there are any particular places where learnings from the two reports overlap or diverge? And what's your take on this?
Okay, thanks very much, Martha, and also for the great presentation. Yes, so I suppose just to kind of very briefly contextualize the research I did, it was an evolution of a piece of work which Paul Hamlyn had created before, the context for it being that the immigration advice sector, which includes asylum advice, has been for ages now trying to do more with less as a result of LASPO coming in, and as a perfect storm really. LASPO came in, decreased immigration advice, and also various policies have meant, including Brexit of course, have meant that immigration advice needs have kind of exponentially increased around the country. So the immigration advice sector is the one I know well. I'm sure this is true in other advice sectors as well, but just to kind of give a shout out for that sector, they are used to moving very quickly on their feet and innovating. So when COVID hit, so one of the ways in which organizations pre-COVID were trying to do more with less was by moving some of their advice to being remote advice. It was a way of regulating the advice flows instead of, for instance, having outreach sessions or drop-in sessions, which generally speaking tended to take more time. When I did a piece of research before the pandemic on remote advice, amongst other methods, what was interesting about that was that almost to a person who I interviewed around the country, they said, it's really, we can't possibly do remote casework. So advice, yes, but when it moved on to casework, the general feeling was that this was much too complicated, particularly given the client group, where obviously you have ingrained issues of language proficiency, and also the cases themselves being fantastically complicated in lots of instances. The only example I found pre-pandemic, in fact, where that was actively being investigated was a project in Scotland, where family reunion cases were being investigated because families who were living on islands, who had been sent to islands, could not easily travel to the known quality providers, who generally speaking are in Glasgow and Edinburgh. And so in order to try and obviate that, they set up a remote casework service to investigate it. And at that point, they were kind of going, you know, this is still quite complicated and there are data security issues and everything. However, of course, what happened with COVID was that this catapulted the whole sector into having to innovate. So what I'm going to pick up on now is where things overlap as far as I picked up. So yes, one of the things that organizations definitely did was that they instigated new ways of triaging clients, because what was particularly important was that all of that winnowing out of clients who didn't actually need very precious specialist advisor time happened in an efficient way before the client got to that specialist advisor. It's difficult to overstress the pressure on specialist advisors who can do OISC 2 and above support at the moment, and the importance of preserving their capacity to do those complex cases. So that was one thing that came up. Another thing that rang very true was about the don't assume the methods which are going to appeal to which client group. So just as an aside, one of the points made to me during the research was that if COVID had happened 5 years previously, or even 3 years previously, it would have been a very different ballgame, because one of the things that facilitated the change to remote advice was that smartphone availability has increased dramatically. So the penetration of smartphones by now to virtually everybody had access to one. Even if they didn't have one, they had access to one. So that really, really helped. The other one was the availability of free or relatively cheap platforms. So 3 years before the pandemic, Microsoft Teams didn't exist, Skype for Business was expensive, Zoom was relatively unknown, and in legal terms, the opportunities for Zoom conferencing and remote conferencing was really expensive. So something like Cisco WebEx was being used, for instance. By the time the pandemic, and obviously prompted in part by the pandemic, those platforms were proliferating left, right, and centre. So those so that was possible. In terms of the age thing, though, one interesting point made to me by, I think, Bristol Refugee Rights was that actually what they found sometimes was that older people they found easier to deal with than younger people who one might have expected to be technology embracers. And that was because although younger people were very fond of sending WhatsApp messages, what they didn't want to do was talk on the phone. They didn't want to actually do the initial debriefing with the advisors. And actually that kind of made them challenge some of the assumptions that they had. Other things that rang true, I mean, yes, there is definitely an increased legal need as a result of the pandemic. That was one thing, although there were one or two things in the immigration advice sector which ironically kind of became easier. The Everyone In scheme, for instance, meant that homeless migrants who needed advice, all of a sudden you could find them as opposed to not be able to find them. So that actually kind of helped some organisations working with that particular target group. But then also one of the things I just wanted to add there, which is driving increased need within immigration, is obviously policy, where, you know, I've mentioned Brexit already, but there are various policies such as NRPF, which the immigration advice sector is constantly dealing with, which continue unabated, and those are driving need as well. There's also, I noted that you said that in the main, more was done. They were able to see more clients. Initially, certainly during COVID, many organisations that I talked to reported that they actually initially dropped the numbers because they had very full books already. They had certain mechanisms set up for those people to come in and find them through drop-in mechanisms or whatever. And actually, one of the things that evolved from that was that there was a big recognition amongst various providers up and down the country that they'd kind of been sitting there with a huge amount of need already coming in through the door. What the pandemic made them do was think, where do we now we can't see those people in that way. How do we get out and find the people who really, really need our advice? And so that led to a whole range of innovation, outreach, basically, through, for instance, putting leaflets into food bank parcels, or putting posters out in various places where they knew, so asylum accommodation, for instance. So it led to organisations reviewing how it was that they were actually going out and reaching people. And that was no bad thing, was the ultimate conclusion, because there was a kind of democratization almost through remote methods, which resulted obviously in some benefits for clients, being that, for instance, mothers with young children didn't have to travel 2 hours across the city in order to go and sit in a drop-in centre and potentially have access to an advisor on that occasion, but potentially also not. So there was there was a need not only to embrace and celebrate the fact that actually those efficiencies were happening, but to pay attention to how are we therefore going to find these people who we know need our advice, but who aren't, because they're all shut behind doors somewhere, able to find us and come and drop into our drop-in centres. So that was another one. Things that I wanted to just kind of, I've got very little time, I can see. The ones I wanted to flag, which we can come back to, the really critical issues in the immigration advice sector: document transfer and data security. So huge need there to think about how clients were actually talking with, but importantly, and I'm sure this is true in other sectors as law areas as well, but in immigration, documents are key, absolutely key. How do you get those transferred safely to your advisor? So there was a whole range of learning around that, which is ongoing. And the sector itself was involved in a pretty lively discussion about what is safe, what isn't safe. Do we use WhatsApp? Do we not? Do we use Facebook Messenger? And ultimately where it came down to was this kind of basic balance between pragmatism, what would clients use, and a kind of, as far as possible, keeping it as safe as possible. So WhatsApp and email were the ones of choice. Some organizations completely refused to use Facebook Messenger after a while, moving clients onto WhatsApp. But then there was a real big issue about how do you get the reams of documents that you need in order, because you need to prove 6 months residence, or you need to show bank statements going back months, and so on and so forth. How do you get those in a way which doesn't then consume your specialist advisor time? Because what they're doing is they have 100 photos of bank statements coming through in no particular order, and what they then have to do is rationalize it. So that then in turn gave rise to organizations thinking about that document collection bit, and a whole range of things emerging there. So people being sent out to accommodation or places, standing at the gate, taking photos of them themselves and then going back. And also new posts being introduced, which actually were kind of document receipt posts, where in the past, people used to turn up to drop-in centres with the famously badged plastic carrier bags of documents, and one of the tasks always was to go through those plastic carrier bags. The phrase virtual plastic carrier bags came into existence because there was something you needed to do with those documents in order to get them ready for the specialist advisor to review them. So that's a new function. And that was another one that came in. I'm just going to kind of mention the other ones was about client-facing technology. I think that was a massive one that has been on the increase. It's partly to do with outreach. It's partly to do with enabling some parts of the initial triage to be done in digitally competent ways. So that's, for instance, a Voices in Exile toolkit has been created, which allows clients to see what documents they're going to need for certain kinds of applications. Citizens Advice Sheffield has got a series of access points using D10 technology. Southwest London Law Centre has developed a crisis navigation service. There's a service that I happen to be evaluating at the moment called Flows for victims of domestic abuse, not immigration related particularly. These are all technological client-facing innovations which are helping clients input data and get that data to a certain extent triaged. And those were also kind of accelerated, I suppose, during COVID. And I think we're going to come on in the next section to kind of where investment needs to happen. But I suppose the bottom line overlap is that hybrid advice is here to stay. The ultimate point about that everybody said was, we have realized that for some client groups in immigration, remember there's a really different kinds of client groups, definitely hybrid and blended advice is good. For some of them, not so much. The one that was particularly mentioned in that regard was asylum seekers, building trust with asylum seekers and getting the relevant details in order to effectively take their case forward requires face-to-face, and complex human rights cases and so on requires face-to-face. But certainly blended delivery is here to stay across the sector. I just wanted to give a final shout out before going on. I'll put the link to the report because it's got masses more in it, the link to the report in the chat. And just a shout out for people as well that there are some workshops happening on there's been the launch of the report, that there's some workshops happening on certain elements, so like data security, for instance, like client-facing technology, being organised by Paul Hamlyn Foundation, and those will be happening from September onwards. So if you're interested in them, let me know your address and I'll put you on the invite list. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Carrie. I can circulate your email address along with the notes, so anyone who wants to get in touch on those workshops can contact you directly. I'm going to
success from our client interviews in particular, one of the things that stood out for me, and maybe Dan, you may have picked up other things that you thought were really insignificant, but one of the things that stood out to me was engagement and willingness or capability to engage. And success in blended delivery appeared to be a sense of autonomy and empowerment within that process. So, for example, we spoke to some clients who were only willing to speak to us for the interview because we had been almost verified by the advisors that they had relied upon in the past. So there is a great deal of trust that needs to be established through blended advice or any form of advice. And we take that for granted, I think, in face-to-face interactions. But when it comes to using technology, it's much harder to build that initial sense of trust and rapport. And so something that was really clear was this is something which needs to be factored into the beginning of that process. So whether that's an initial face-to-face meeting to build that trust and that relationship with the advisor, or if it's putting extra effort into that initial phone call or Zoom call or whatever it may be, that was really central to success, I think, in my view.
Amazing. And Carrie,
okay, so to clarify, that they're not all doing triage. Some of them are helping to do elements of the process. So the Voices in Exile is about helping people who otherwise probably wouldn't get advice because there isn't enough advice to go round. It's about helping them understand what is needed for certain applications and get their documents lined up. That's the Voices in Exile toolkit. The Sheffield example is different again. The Sheffield example is where these remote access points, so effectively a camera is being put into a room in a public library, for instance, and that camera has a touch screen and you can go in and the client can touch the screen and then get through to an advisor in real time and talk to them. So it's effectively extending access. So they're all different, those tools that I said. I suppose, to speak to your question, I mean, I think one of the things which constitutes success, I think one of the things that actually looking at this whole issue has forced in the immigration advice sector is a re-looking at how everybody is being picked up. And I do think we need to kind of acknowledge that there's a difficulty when we're talking about this, because no immigration advice provider pre-pandemic was sitting around twiddling their thumbs. They were inundated already. So when we are talking about are clients happy with the advice, and is the advice client-centered, every immigration advice provider will be doing that as far as possible, but they were also aware of a hinterland of need, which they were unable to deal with. So one of the success factors, if we're looking at it at that macro level, of blended advice coming in, is that more people can be helped, I think. More people can be helped because specialist advisor time is being used to best effect and being used for the complex areas that needs to happen. And I include in that building relationships of trust with clients, but the other functions of document collection, organization, triage, winnowing out those cases which actually aren't immigration advice, they're other things, because like in all other areas, I'm sure, you know, lots of things present at once. Those are the things which kind of need to get more efficient and can be done more remotely and or through digital tools, I think. So that's the kind of top line point, I think, that more clients can be reached.
Great. Yeah, I think it's really interesting as we talk around about this, about there seems like quite a specific role for technology and tools in this. And as you said, Kerry, it's about winnowing out those specific areas where a technology intervention can have this efficiency impact. I think it's really, really important point to drill down on, which is this aspect of preserving specialist capacity, and what this whole process, what there's a whole different innovation around different service delivery methods means.
Absolutely. I think that there will always be some factors, some indicative factors, and people who have worked in the sector long enough will have a sense for certain characteristics, certain circumstances, certain problems that will make it more likely that certain methods will be appropriate. So, for example, we identified those themes even within the small scale of our study. There are certain issues for which it was clear that people in those circumstances were likely to benefit from a particular method. So, for example, people with mobility related disabilities, this opened up a whole new world of accessibility for them because they were able to engage remotely. But for others, it was less clear cut. And for those situations, and pretty much every situation, basically the advisors that participated in our focus groups made really clear that you can make no assumptions. Somebody with a mobility related disability may also have another circumstance which requires them to come and see you face to face because they can't effectively use technology, or any kind of other range of circumstances. So essentially it is very unpredictable, although that will of course be bound up in a human element of people having a lot of experience in the sector, and they are the experts working on the front line. So it's always a balance between making your best judgment, but also always taking the time to ask, I think.
And the importance of that expertise as well, which people have built up by dedicating a career to working at frontline organisations and in this respect. And
I can answer that a bit for the immigration advice lot. So it depends. I mean, it's happening in a range of ways. As already said, some of there's an interesting area of exploration at the moment as to whether or not how much triage can happen digitally, and there are pros and cons of it. Is basically what people. So for instance, at Central England Law Centre, they've been kind of looking at potential apps for this. The Southwest London tool is looking at that. So you know, you go through and you answer questions, and depending on your answers to the questions, your issue is identified. I should mention, perhaps this is happening in another project I know about at the moment, which is around the area of domestic abuse. So there is a fantastic project run by RCJ Advice and Rights of Women, and they have a court nav tool which has been developed over many years, which is all about the application for non-molestation orders. And that tool, that online tool, court nav, does triage. So it kind of filters out people who, for one reason or another, will not need or be able to get a non-molestation order. For instance, if some people want a non-molestation order against their neighbour, and you can't get that. There's that kind of thing. But also in other areas, triage is happening by trained volunteers, for instance, Hackney Migrant Centre, always supervised, who are asking the questions and then are trained themselves first of all, and then are asking the questions to ascertain whether or not this is a case which then needs to go on and actually see a specialist advisor. To make the point, that wasn't completely new after COVID, that has been happening for some time, but I think it received a kind of boost during COVID, because what was happening, of course, was that the triage was happening online. And that documents, for instance, which could have been quickly viewed at a drop-in centre, were then having to be looked at, transferred, and all of that process would have taken far, far longer than a specialist advisor standing at a drop-in centre just quickly giving a review of them. So that was where a whole new raft of posts and roles came in, I think, which was about collecting that initial information. And I'm talking immigration here. I don't know if this is relevant for other areas, so I imagine it is a bit. Collecting all the information one needs to be able to then ascertain whether or not this is a case requiring immigration advice, and if so, whether or not that then gets passed to a specialist advisor.
Yeah. Fantastic. Again, really, really helpful to have that level of insight, and always really interesting, and so wonderful to have it kind of collated here, this raft of experience and insights from across so many different service providers as well.
One thing that I didn't mention in my Gallup, but it did get mentioned by you guys, was partnerships. So an absolutely critical part of some organisations being able to continue during the pandemic was that they had strong partnerships with people in the statutory and voluntary sector who could do some of that wraparound support and sometimes some of that document gathering and so on. And without that, particularly for some client groups, it would not have been possible to do the remote advice. So thinking particularly about victims of trafficking, thinking about people who are in care homes who needed EUSS applications, it was absolutely critical that voluntary organisations who were wanting to support them with advice had strong partnerships with those organisations still in contact with them. So quite definitely with some organisations, they reported that they had increased and strengthened partnerships across the sector in order to allow them to kind of reach certain client groups. So I think that was a big one.
I would echo that as well, and say that the organisations that we spoke to who were located in more rural areas were already quite well set up for this. But even those that weren't rapidly worked to develop those partnerships, because it was quite often a logistical issue in terms of it enabled them to reach a broader range of clients, because by having links with social workers, for example, people who were going to do home visits could sit the person down and put them in front of an iPad, and that would enable access in a way that they would not have otherwise been possible. So I definitely echo that partnership thing was really, really key to success during the midst of the pandemic, and hopefully those partnerships will continue because they probably have quite a lot of potential for ensuring the success of blended advice in the future as well.
I think that's something that really stands out to me, because one of my questions initially was, is there a science here? And there's obviously not. You know, we talked at length about, you know, how this needs to be a case-by-case approach. But what that means to me is obviously that we need a greater understanding of our users. And particularly, we've mentioned a couple of times at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of fallout in terms of how do we reach those marginalized communities that would have just walked in off the street, but now they are removed from us. We've got no way of contacting them or reaching out to them. And that's where that kind of partnership and that effective outreach to community-based organizations kind of really comes into that. This is a method this is a method to increase your level of understanding about who your users are, who your clients are, and how you can reach them. It's that partnership element that can really provide that.
One of the things we heard from quite a few advisors, which I think stuck with me as a really important point, was that they were concerned that policymakers and funders might get seduced by the numbers, because with blended advice, there was an ability to see a much larger quantity of clients, so they could produce this huge volume. There was this real worry that there might become a focus on, okay, well, you can do it much more efficiently. You can read off that volume of clients. We want you to carry on doing that. But one thing they wanted us to communicate was that there still needs to be that quality, that time and space for a more holistic service, because some clients will always need a lot more time than others. Like Kerry mentioned, some will have multiple intersecting issues. You know, problem clustering is always going to be a time to spend more time with some clients than others. And it's going to be about getting that balance. There are some ways in which blended can help, because it can mean more clients can be seen more efficiently, more effectively, more quickly. Not every client needs that amount of time, but some will. So it's about the sector. What we heard was that they wanted policymakers to understand that there is going to be that balance, and that blended doesn't solve all these problems, because suddenly we're seeing so many more clients. Because again, like Kerry mentioned earlier on, there are a whole heap of clients who are missing and took a lot more effort to find, to track down, to spend that time with. So you might be seeing loads more clients than you were 2 years ago, but those clients from 2 years ago might not be seen at all. So there needs to be the funding to allow that space, that more holistic approach. So that's one of the things we heard was key. And then when we talked to people about what they wanted, you know, the message to go out was, it was not to be seduced by the numbers, and to realize that it was still need to fund that more holistic advice.
I mean, yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, in terms of, which question are we on now? Is it the question, what should people be funding?
Afraid so.
Or we are still at the horrible question none of us can answer. If it's on what people should be funding, so a few points here, I think. One thing the pandemic did was stimulate innovation around tech. But again, this wasn't the beginning of innovation around tech solutions, right? So the pandemic wasn't where it wasn't year zero on this. Lots had been happening before. I think one of the things that was revealed was that in some places, in a few, very few, sorry, there's a dog coughing behind me, in very few places, there were tech people within the organization who were there to think through issues like data security, like the integration of how clients send information, be that emails or be that evidence. How do you integrate that into your case management system without spending absolutely ages copying and pasting? So there are some intelligent case management systems which can do that. Clio kept popping up as one of the best, but there are others. And so what was needed there was some kind of intelligent assessment of what was needed in-house and guiding organizations through this. So a point made to me several times was, you know, lawyers aren't always, be careful how I speak here, aren't always change embracers. They tend to kind of, you know, like things as they have been. I used to be the director of a legal centre. I know this I know this to my cost. So actually introducing new tech like that can take time, and actually it needs to be led from inside an organization. But also there's an issue here about the unknown unknowns. So you don't know what you don't know around tech. I regard myself as kind of tech vaguely competent, but not really. But, I can kind of get by. I think an awful lot of people in advice agencies get by in terms of tech, because actually, why should they do more than that? They're advisors, they're experts in their particular subject. Tech itself is, I had my mind blown by some of the conversations I had with, frankly, bluntly, geeks within the sector who kind of walked me through all the things that kind of they thought about and that they had reviewed in the light of the pandemic. And they range from the really basic, like, if you are going to have a good advice call with somebody, you need to have a proper microphone and headphones. The difference between being able to be heard clearly, particularly when English isn't your first language, and not being heard clearly is immense, much more than we might think. So there are really basic things like that. There are really basic things around data security as to the equipment you need in the room, but there are also loads of other really complicated things about how do you then develop apps which are going to actually help clients. So apps were being developed, for instance, the Refugee Rights Hub at Sheffield Hallam University developed an app for their clients to help clients input directly into their case management system. They could send documents through this app and it then gets, and they can store it on their case management system. The time savings in this are enormous. If you're not doing that, you are spending huge amounts of time copying and pasting documents, not to mention security issues. But in order to drive that innovation, you need people who know what they're doing. And just as an aside on this, some of the benefits, I found one tech person who has been installed in an organization and who has brought multiple benefits, not just for the provision of immigration advice, but also they managed to review other elements of the tech. For instance, how their website was being run and created and content updated. And they revealed through this that what was being charged by a website company was ludicrously more than they actually needed to do, because smoke and mirrors, you need us to do this, you need us to do that. Thousands of pounds is going out the door to that. And actually they saved them money on their website. So the key the key point here is that tech specialism is a specialism and should not just be kind of like cobbled together on the sides, just like, oh, who's up for doing this? And that needs to be invested in by funders if this kind of blended delivery is really to happen. We need leaders and thoughtful teachers of tech within advice agencies if we are to evolve the systems in a way which is both client friendly and efficient of the use of specialist advisor time.
I think that it's something that the sector is already very good at doing, which is knowledge sharing and supporting each other and collaborating with each other. I think that all of the organizations we spoke to had already put in place measures, at least within their own organization, to share knowledge, share best practices, and to support each other, especially when they were working remotely. And so that kind of model is not something that is new to the advice sector. I think that's something that they can do very well already. So it's almost kind of just scaling that up, and kind of linking back to the funding question as well. A lot of the funding models that were introduced during the pandemic treated the pandemic as kind of a temporary incident that the advice organizations needed to weather in order to get to the other side where everything would be back to normal again. And actually that's not the reality at all in terms of the level and type of legal need that advice organizations are seeing. So something which is acknowledging that longer term nature of that would be helpful, and therefore investing in these capacities, forums, opportunities to share knowledge, share best practices, and to understand the things that work and don't work in different contexts, I think would be really helpful. And I suppose trusting the advice sector to plan and prepare is something which was quite central as well. So not just dealing with funding models that require organizations to reapply for funding every few years, something that allows them to plan in the longer term, invest in technology up front, invest in working practices, training staff, volunteers, etc., with a view of knowing that they could use that in the longer term and not have to reinvent the wheel every time.
Yeah, Absolutely.
Can I just pick up on a point that's been raised in the chat by Rachel?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So the tech support should be provided sector-wide. Absolutely, it should, because ultimately you can't afford one tech person probably per specialist provider. You know, what size of provider before you get a tech person inside, for instance. But hubs of expertise, and I should say, I think that this is different from communities of practice where people in the sector share information around tech. Those exist. They exist in the immigration sector anyway, and are facilitated in that case by the Refugee Action Frontline Immigration Advice Project on a Slack channel. And there's some great stuff that happens there. But like all of those communities in practice, they're only as good as you have time to consult them. And, you know, and actually everybody's quite busy. So how often do people check into the Slack? So they tend to kind of draw people who are passionate about the subject, but not until crises happen often do people go to them to kind of check things out. It requires an add-on to that, which is to have active support being offered to organizations to audit and to review and to put in place new bog standard, let's call it that, kind of tech things like case management systems, but also to audit, trial, pilot, and then promote new systems as they come in, to find out whether or not there's any, they've got legs for the sector more broadly. Innovation is great. Funders do like to fund innovation, and that is fantastic. And a message around funding immigration, innovation is that, and immigration, I should say, but innovation is that, you know, let 1,000 flowers bloom. The critical point, I think sometimes, which is missing, that funders don't necessarily support, is the flower may have bloomed, it may have become a great big amaryllis of a flower, but then the funding to then pick that up, roll it out, and parlay it, translate it into other contexts is missing. And that is losing a trick. That is really losing a trick.
Yeah, it's kind of almost stymieing what you want to happen around, you know, spreading these successful stories. And we talk a lot about scaling up and scaling out of solutions. And that's the bit of the funding that seems to be missing, is the okay, but how do you trial it? How, as you said, audit, trial, and promote. That's the essential core part of scaling services, surely.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. I think the future research is a really important point. I think that, you know, our study was a rapid review of what was happening in the sector, and it was very much a small scale qualitative study. What needs to be done is to replicate those exploratory methods in other areas of law where we provide advice in these blended formats. And we also then need to scale this up to a quantitative, more comprehensive evaluation of what works and what doesn't work, because there is no point throwing money at anything without robust data. And those two things can be done at the same time. You can improve funding to the sector and improve and strengthen that infrastructure at the same time as embedding mechanisms to collect data, which we can use for ongoing evaluation and monitoring of what resources are needed and where they need to be targeted. So I feel like that's kind of something, a commitment we can make at this point. There is a turning point post-pandemic where we can acknowledge that things have changed, the demands have changed, and say this is the moment where we need to invest in data collection, rigorous research, and ongoing evaluation.
Amazing. Yeah, absolutely. And I know there is also work going on in the sector about data, and I'm not proposing to pull people into the discussion at this point, but it would be useful maybe as part of the follow-up to see, okay, exactly what from these learnings can we take into data points that were, Tracy's just replied anyway. Tracy, you know what we're talking about. I refer you to Tracy's comment in the chat because she's brilliant. She knows exactly what she's talking about. So yeah, there's something that we can do there around pulling these strands together and seeing, you know, from a frontline and practical perspective, what does that look like in terms of what you're asking people to implement in terms of infrastructure and roles and leadership.